Yes, thank you. Chairman Giles and honorable members of the New Hampshire House Education Committee. For the record, I am Representative Murataki from Nashva's 5th Ward. I'm one of 9 at-large members of the National Board of Education and chair its Curriculum and Evaluation Committee. HB 1432 delays for 2 years the implementation of the Common Core State Standards Implementation Framework as adopted by the State Board in July of 2012. Specifically, the high-stakes assessments called the Smarter Balanced Assessment. This bill also requires the Legislative Oversight Committee to study the feasibility of implementing the planned education improvements in New Hampshire's public schools contained in the minimum standards for public school approval, including the DOE's CCSS implementation framework. So about a year ago, I introduced my first bill to this committee relative to STEM education in our universities. I had no clue at that time that a year later, I would be introducing a bill that would delay the SBA by 2 years. So our district, since the adoption by the state of the Common Core, has been developing very, very carefully, as carefully as we could, implementation plans. We've been aligning curriculum, deploying nearly $2 million of new technology for instruction and assessment, and carefully selecting core-aligned textbooks and resources. So we have been diligently at work since July of 2010 doing this, and it's essentially, fortunately in Nashville, we have a strategic budgeting process. So we've actually lined up a strategic budgeting plan, 3 years at a time, which incorporated the changes that we felt we would need to be minimally compliant with the state's new standards. So, however, the past year has been very revealing. Remember I said a year ago I had no idea I was going to be bringing this bill before you. The past year has shown some states like New York and Kentucky that gave high-stakes assessments and had numerous difficulties. I'm sure you've heard about some of them over the past week or so, and you'll probably be hearing more about them later today. In March of 2013, the American Federation of Teachers commissioned the Hart Research Associates to conduct a survey of teachers' opinions on the Common Core. That's that thick document that I distributed to you. So I provided both the electronic and hard copies of that study, and this study actually explains much of the dichotomy that we as decision makers and policy makers hear from both sides of the Common Core divide. Because that's one of the things that I believe that as members of boards of education or members of the legislature, we're constantly hearing from both sides. Oh, the teachers love the Common Core. Oh, the teachers and educators, have real problems with the Common Core. Well, the answer to that is actually in that study. What you're going to find is that both of those answers are true. And whether or not you're a proponent or an opponent of Common Core, in many instances, people who provide testimony selectively pick and choose out of the statistics that they like. And that's part of that confusion. So I invite you at your leisure to either go through the hard copy or the electronic version of that Hart Research Associates study. It's very intriguing. For example, I'll just breeze through and summarize that study. 75% of teachers approve of Common Core state standards. The Hart Research Associates study had 800 AFP teachers. 600 of them said that they liked the Common Core curriculum standards. However, there is the rest of the story. 74% of the teachers worry that assessments will begin before instructional practice is aligned. 2 in 5 say their districts are not well prepared to implement Common Core. As nearly as 76% of teachers gave not done enough answers when asked, has your district done enough to prepare for CCSS? Only 1 in 4 has received the tools and resources needed to teach the Common Core. More than half think that the Common Core implementation will increase testing emphasis. That's what we call teach to the test. That's considered bad. 69, or just 1/3 were satisfied with the teacher input for implementation plans by their districts and state. 69% strongly favor require school districts to reach an agreement with the unions representing teachers in a plan for implementation of Common Core. And 63% favor establish a moratorium on high-stakes consequences for students, teachers, and schools. So, as you can see, it is true that the strong majority, 75%, like the Common Core curriculum standards. They like the idea of a national standards that raises the bar for what is taught to the students. But on the other hand, about as many don't feel that they or their schools are ready for it. So I think that's the thing that you need to take away from that study. All right, about 1 month after the study was taken, U.S. Education Secretary Arne Duncan admitted to flaws in Common Core assessments and called for the use of Assessment 2.0 on April 30th, 2013. On the same day, the presidents of both the AFT and NEA called for 2-year moratoriums on Common Core high-stakes assessments and consequences. Although I cannot speak for our union, I've heard from national teachers that the rank and file agree with their national AFT. The outpouring of concern by Fairgrounds Middle School teachers when Principal Nelson brought forward in a letter published in the National Telegraph supports this. And by the way, I provided copies of that a week ago when I testified in another bill. In May of 2013, the National School Board Association, the School Superintendents Association, the National Association of Elementary School Principals, and the National Association of Secondary School Principals wrote in a joint statement, by the way, which has been distributed to you as copies, strong educational standards can be an important tool for improving student achievement, but states and school districts must be well prepared to successfully implement the Common Core state standards. For the standards to succeed, states and school districts must have the financial resources and the infrastructure to manage online assessments, and they must be able to provide school administrators and teachers with the professional development. Getting this transition right can mean the difference between getting and keeping public and educator support for the Common Core, or a loss in confidence in the standards and even the public schools, especially if, as expected, the first-year scores will disappoint. The concept of online assessments is widely supported by educators, but the timeline, quote, could derail the good work already in place through the CCSS and deny the assessments the opportunity to provide the same academic benefits, according to that document. So in a September 2013 letter to the New Hampshire State Board of Education regarding the new ED 306, which was approved by the JLCAR last month, the association echoed the comments of these national educator groups. So this is our New Hampshire School Board Association. Additionally, these required policy-related changes will come at the very time when school boards continue to grapple with yet-to-be-defined changes, apparently required by the ESEA waiver, the implementation of the Common Core state standards, and a transition to the smarter balanced assessment tools, to name but several prominent and new state and or federal mandates. Simply put, much has been put on the plate of local school boards and school districts by state and federal authorities, and we urge the state board to proceed with deliberate speed on these initiatives. We urge a carefully crafted strategy that will enable all in the Public Education Committee to study, assess, and reasonably implement the new initiatives. Significantly, the department has stated that its intent to keep these changes cost neutral. The overarching reality is that the proposed changes will have a significant financial impact on local school districts and local communities. So in November, Kansas withdrew from the Common Core testing. The Massachusetts State Board of Education, the same month, also voted to delay the Common Core assessments due to a number of perceived issues related with the high-stakes assessments. They're currently determining what to do. So one possibility is the continued use of the MCAS until a validated Assessment 2.0 can be fielded. If Massachusetts were a country, it would regularly place with the top 10 worldwide with math standards, and is often viewed as a paragon for state educational standards, especially in math. Their state math standards were also rated as one of the top math standards until they adopted the Common Core in July 2010. about the same time New Hampshire adopted the Common Core. So now I'll just go ahead and talk to the two main paragraphs.
Yeah, you've already used your 10 minutes.
Oh, I'm
so
sorry,
please
it'll be
wrap
very,
up
very
as soon
quick,
as
my
possible.
apologies.
Thank
All
you.
right. So the purpose of the first paragraph is to place in legislation a 2-year delay in the DOE's Common Core State Standards Implementation Framework, specifically to move the timeline for the Smarter Balanced Assessment back by 2 years. We need to do this because essentially the RSA 186.5 powers of the school, the State Board of Education, essentially places them into a shall position of mandating over the local school boards. So in the second paragraph, statewide improvement and assessment, what this paragraph does is to establish in legislation, in RSA 193-C:7, the specific responsibilities of holding statewide public hearings on these assessments, not just the assessments, but the public school education reforms in general. These include topics like unfunded mandates and grade level appropriateness. So basically in Nashua, our teachers have been involved in aligning their curriculums with Common Core since the 2010 to 2011 school year. It really picked up speed in the last 2 years, this last school year and this current school year. One of the things that we, especially in the Curriculum and Evaluation Committee, have noticed is that this really increased the rate at which parents and teachers came to members of the committee and members of the board, confiding in some difficulties that they were having with the Common Core. I just want you to understand that these problems with the Common Core are real. They're not imagined. They're not lunatic fringe. These are real teachers and real parents that are known to us by name and by face that have come to us at the National School Board, essentially, giving us insight into some of the difficulties. I personally believe that the Common Core curriculum standards should move forward, and that given enough time and given enough resources that we can actually improve these standards to the point where they live up to their dream. But right now, especially listening to what Secretary Duncan said, we really should be looking for an assessment 2.0, and I ask this committee to support with an opt-to-pass this bill. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. Questions for Representative Moritaki? Representative.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Thank you for taking my question. I'm not sure if this is a good question for you or somebody from the Board of Education, but do you know if there's any agreements that DOE has signed that would make this moratorium a problem?
I do not. I think that should wait until perhaps another person, maybe from the department.
Thank you.
Yes.
Representative Myler, then Representative Grenier, and then Representative Schmidt.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Representative, for taking my question. I guess I'm a little confused and I need a clarification.
Sure.
Your testimony was primarily focused on the issue of a moratorium on the
High stakes assessments, right, and
But
consequences.
as I look at the bill, it seems to me the bill goes way beyond that.
In what way?
It seems to me, and this is a clarification I need to ask.
Right.
You talk about, is this to stop the implementation of the Common Core? The reason why I asked that question is you talk about a legislative oversight committee, which is referenced in the law, to look at everything. So it looks to me like even though your testimony was talking about a high-stake test, your bill actually goes way beyond the high-stake test moratorium.
I don't believe that's the case, and let me explain why. There are two functional parts of this bill. The first one basically goes ahead and requires there's a Common Core implementation framework that it's a matrix that's posted on the State Department of Education website. It clearly states that the districts within New Hampshire have to deploy the Smarter Balanced Assessment for grade levels 3 through 8 and 11 by the spring of 2015. This year's NECAP was the last of the NECAP tests prior to the implementation and full deployment of the Smarter Balanced Assessment. So the first part of the bill, whether or not it clearly enough stated this or not, has but one purpose. And that is to basically instruct the Department of Education and the Board of Education to change the chart so that it no longer says spring of 2015, but delays that, because that's what it currently says, is spring of 2015. This is consistent with the call for a delay, by the AFT, by the NEA, and by other education groups. The second part of the bill, if the first part of the bill passes, then what this does is it provides the Legislative Oversight Committee. One of the things I did was to look around to see when was the last time the LOC actually investigated and reported out on an education issue. Now, I may be mistaken, but the last report I was able to find dated from about 2008 and dealt with whether or not the state should use its public resources, whether state or at the local level, on education related with special needs students. Now, I may be wrong, but that was the last thing I could find. I also discovered that that study was actually instructed within the RSA. So the second part of the bill is essentially to go ahead and provide the Legislative Oversight Committee with instructions to go ahead and conduct a study and public hearings around different parts of the state. And I believe that the bill stipulates that public hearings should be held in every executive council district. That seems to be a fair way of distributing the public hearings around the state.
Thank you.
Representative Brennan.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for taking my question. In your research regarding the opinions of educators on this new, what you call high-stakes test, did you go back and consider the concerns of educators with NECAP, with Terra Nova, and way back when our state first developed our frameworks, a test that was only statewide, that included in language arts, science, history, and math. I'm curious about the concerns that we have here regarding, in comparison to, I certainly felt, similar concerns whenever we instituted a new testing.
Thank you very much for the question. And by the way, I did. Historically, I basically went back to see whether or not there had been similar concerns when No Child Left Behind instituted a requirement for summative assessments on an annual basis. And like the SBA and the PARC, they also required summative testing for grade levels 3 and 8 and 11. So yes, absolutely, there were concerns, there were complaints, there were the same usual complaints that you get about, whether or not the national government, should be mandating education requirements to the states and to the local districts. Yes, I saw all of them, but, and here's the but, the degree to which those concerns were expressed did not seem to reach down to the individual level of teachers and principals. One of the things, and maybe this is because back in the early days of NECAP, YouTube was not such a prominent feature on the social web. But the thing was, if I did actually go ahead and attempt to determine whether or not there were instances in which there were even personal testimonies, whether written or whether or not in media, and I did not find just qualitatively. I didn't perform a statistical significant study of incidences. That would probably make a good PhD dissertation someday. But the thing is, I did not find the degree or the extent of concerns that I saw. In particular, when I went back and looked at the statements from national organizations like the National School Board Association, what I found was that when we went from the No Child Left Behind assessments to the initial promotion of the Common Core by the Obama administration, in 2009, and then ramped up again when the 45 state governors essentially adopted the Common Core. It just sort of increased almost by an order of magnitude some of the complaints that were coming from national educator groups. So I don't know if that answers your question, but
I hope it does. Thank you, Representative Grenier. Representative Schmidt?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Representative. I would like you to, I'm gonna try to keep it short. I would like you to address the downside of your bill in that if we delay the assessment, we delay the data, and it seems like the data would be useful to point out areas where district could improve and concentrate on the implementation. In other words, we're losing information by delaying. And how would you address that?
thank you very much for the question. By the way, please understand that I was pretty early on, with the exception of the thought that it might be an unfunded mandate. I actually liked a lot of the features that I saw about both the Common Core curriculum and the Smarter Balanced Assessment. Within the last year, I've turned around, and the reason for that is that while I see the potential value of the tests, especially the adaptive tests like the Smarter Balanced Assessment, and its focus on things like grit and other characteristics, what I realized, and the teachers and the parents were helping me to realize this through their own testimonies to me, is that on the one hand, it would be useful to have these data points. But on the other hand, these aren't Toyotas we're talking about. These aren't video games. These are our children. And to use children and school teachers as data points in some kind of a nationally orchestrated plan on collecting information about national curriculum, to me it seems a bit over the edge.
Thank you for your testimony, Representative Moritaki. I will call on,
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, members of the committee. My name is John, most people call me Jack Kelly, and I also represent Ward 5 in Nashua. In fact, Representative Moritaki and I had a run against each other 2 years ago. We're on both sides of the aisle. We both served on the Nashua School Board, myself until 2012, and Representative Moritaki is still there. We have seen Common Core from its very beginning start up here. And I'm afraid, from what I have seen, it reminds me of the nightmare that No Child Left Behind was. No Child Left Behind had no possible way that it could succeed. The latest kneecap for the city of Nashua shows our juniors in high school are reading at 47% of grade level. Now that was supposed to be 100% according to No Child Left Behind. It never got above 50%. And those schools in our district, elementary and middle school, are seldom above 60, 65%. So that was a complete failure. And I'm afraid we're rushing into the implementation of Common Core and the testing. Everything is going to be the same as it was with No Child Left Behind. You teach to the test. Forget about everything else, kids. You don't need to know any of that stuff. And unfortunately, we leave students very deprived of an education that way. I'm sure you could talk to kids who have no idea of U.S. history, no idea of geography around the country, no idea of any of these subjects, because they've been so stressed out about taking tests on reading and on math. And I think it's time for us to have the State Board of Education step back, watch everybody else, and see what they do. If there are failures, let's at least see where they are, rather than us make those failures. I think it's prudent that we at least take a look at those things. And for that reason, I agree with Representative Moritaki.
thank you for your testimony. Questions for Representative Kelly? Representative Ladd, well,
Thank you very much, Representative, for taking my question. Are you familiar with what the state of Michigan did? They froze all funding for Common Core and implementation of that in the last year.
No, I'm not aware of that.
A follow-up question. Then are you also familiar then with the report that came out in December 1, 2013 by their oversight committee that the freeze has been lifted and that in an assessment of all the testing, PARC, ACT Aspire, McGraw-Hill CTB, that Smarter Balance was rated top of all the 12 instruments they looked at, and in all categories, including security, cost, Common Core alignment, technical requirements. Are you aware that they've gone through that, just what we're doing, and they've come out and said, yeah, go forward because it is the best?
My only question is, who made that recommendation? Was it administrators in the schools? Was it teachers in the schools? Or was that feedback from parents and students?
It was a thorough investigation study by that state to ensure that it aligned with what they wanted to do
But as I
and
said-
how they wanted to assess that.
I understand that, and any district can come forward, and any state can come forward with those kind of statistics. But unless they come from the right place, which is at the teaching level, they don't mean anything. I mean, our Board of Education, State Board of Education here can say everything's fine. But if they don't look at the different school districts in the state, they have no idea of knowing. And they can come out and say anything they want. And I'm sorry, 8 years on the school board, I really fail to believe a lot of that stuff.
Thank you for your testimony, Representative Kelly. Representative Kelly.
Oh, we don't want to hold up the military.
No?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, fellow committee members. For the record, my name is Glenn Cordelli, and I represent Tufton Borough, Moulton Borough, and Sandwich in the beautiful Lakes region. And I'd like to just touch on a couple of points where I have concerns and support this bill. First, privacy. We're going to be talking more about that later this week. But I just found it interesting. This is the Smarter Balanced privacy policy, 2 pages. This is the park privacy policy, 15 pages in length, covers everything from training to encryption to destruction of information. None of that is covered in the Smarter Balanced privacy policy. My other main concern, and I think something's been left out in this conversation, is the special needs children. And I'd like to start with a quote from Dr. Gary Thompson of the Early Child Life Psychology and Education Center. When you have an adaptive computer test, we're not sure of the stimuli that's going to come from that. There's a high risk for that population to have to complete an emotional letdown right in the middle of testing. In New York State, the state senator has requested that the State Department of Education slow down and look specifically, study testing for children with special needs. The federal government, US DOE, has proposed rules to eliminate what's known as the 2% rule. The 2% rule allows for some students with disabilities to be tested under modified academic achievement standards and allowed to count as many as 2% of all these students as proficient. Under the elimination, schools would no longer be able to rely on the modified standards after this school year. Instead, they would have to have students take the general assessments meeting college and career readiness standards. New York has answered that in some with a waiver request to the federal government to do what's known as out-of-level testing, off-grade level testing, where students are not assessed based on their grade level, but their academic achievement level. Very controversial. And I'd just like to close with a letter from a special ed parent. This is in Florida with their assessments that they've already started. This is from a mother of an 11-year-old son who was under hospice care. She was writing to a school board member. I am writing to appeal for your advocacy on behalf of Ethan, who is dying. He has been in hospice care for the past month. We are in the last days of his life. His loving and dedicated teacher has been visiting him every day, bringing some love, peace, and light into his last days. How do we know that he knows that she is there? Because he opens his eyes and gives her a little smile. He is content and comforted after she leaves. Jennifer is a great example of what a dedicated teacher should be. About a week ago, she hesitantly told me that the district will require a medical update for a continuation of the medical waiver allowed for her son for the adapted assessment. Apparently, my communication through her that he was in hospice wasn't enough They required a letter from the hospice company to state that he was dying. Every day she comes to visit, she is required to do paperwork to document his progress. Seriously? Why is Ethan not meeting 6th grade hospital homebound curriculum requirements? Because he is in a morphine coma. We expect him to go any day. He is clinging to his life. This madness has got to stop. Please help us. Ethan died last Friday. His family was still being hassled about the paperwork for a waiver from the assessment test. Please, let's slow down. Let's look at these assessments. Let's look at the impact of the elimination of the 2% rule. There are so many unanswered questions. Children are more than test scores. Thank you.
Madam Chair, thank you, and honorable members of the committee. I thank you. For the record, my name is Mary Heath, and I currently represent District 14 in Manchester's Ward 7. I'm a retired dean of Southern New Hampshire University School of Education and former deputy commissioner for the New Hampshire Department of Education. I'm also a certified teacher, former assistant superintendent, and have worked many years at the high school level as a learning disability specialist. For me, I am here today to oppose House Bill 1432. It's time to put New Hampshire students first. House Bill 1432 takes New Hampshire education apart and dismisses the work of our educators, parents, community members, Department of Education, and New Hampshire State Board of Education. House Bill 1432 says that for the next 2 years, contrary to federal law and jeopardizing millions of federal education funds, there will be no summative assessments of any kind given in New Hampshire. It doesn't just prohibit the Smarter Balance Consortium, it prohibits any annual test at all, which is a problem. For many years, I worked as an educator where we didn't have standards and we didn't have assessments. We have come a long, long way from there. We are making progress. Our students are making progress. Another aspect of this legislation is that it dismisses the competency-based education around which our 176 school districts have reorganized their instruction, grading systems, and assessments. It also discredits the 18 months of public hearings that the state has conducted regarding the New Hampshire minimum standards. I believe this bill usurps the authority of local school districts, the New Hampshire Department of Education, and the New Hampshire State Board of Education. We have seen significant progress in our schools. As much as I struggled with No Child Left Behind, and I certainly struggled, we've seen many changes. We have consistent curriculum in our school districts. We have standards to which our teachers are working. We are monitoring the progress of each and every single child. Research has shown that our students with disabilities are achieving at higher levels. We have made significant progress. We don't want to stop this progress. While things aren't perfect by any means, I think we are making huge strides. Learning is a process. The implementation of the assessment is also part of the learning process. As the former dean of Southern New Hampshire University's School of Education, we spent hours looking at our coursework and incorporating the Common Core standards into that coursework, talking with our potential students about the importance of really looking at the progress of each and every child and how do we know they're learning. This assessment is part of that journey, and I ask that you please vote to ITL this piece of legislation. I have a lot more to say, but we have lots of other people to be heard from, and I will leave my written testimony with you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I know I stand between you and the military, so I'll be brief. Usually I'm on the other side of that. Exactly. Representative Keith said some of the things I was going to say, so I will abridge my remarks just to reintroduce myself. I'm President and CEO of Northeast Delta Dental, Tom Raffio. I'm also Chairman of the State Board of Education and have been on that board since 2007, so I'm one of the longest running board members. I'm also the co-chairman of a group called the New Hampshire Coalition for Business and Industry. It's a group of 45 or so business leaders, educators, public policy makers such as Representative Giles and Senator Stiles. And we have met 5 times, and I must tell you that that group, again, is driven by business. They're totally behind moving forward with the Common Core. We have to really get on with it. I also want to comment on my role as State Board of Education. I have the total support of my Delta Dental Board of Directors, but I probably spend as much time on the State Board of Education as I do worrying about healthcare reform in my primary job. So I can tell you in response to one of the comments, we never say anything as a State Board member without our facts and without doing our homework. We have most recently spent a great deal of time on creating the latest edition of the minimum standards. As you know, they were done in 2007, and then 7 years later you have to redo them. So I spend a lot of time doing that job, as well as talking with teachers. In my high school yearbook, it said I wanted to become a teacher. So I didn't end up being that way, but I spent a lot of time with teachers at the grassroots level. So I want to get my hands around any policies that we implement as a board. I want to make sure the teachers know how to implement it. So you all know about New Hampshire public education, and you know that this bill can potentially really damage public education in New Hampshire. So this is how I see it. As Representative Heath just said, the second paragraph commands the state to redo, in 6 months' worth of regional committee hearings and a report, the work of the State Board, the Department of Education, and our school districts that have spent the last 10 years doing. As Mary said, it's not perfect, but it's a decade of work. It's a process. We really need to move forward. And as I read the bill, to me, the legislation seeks to turn back the clock on the Common Core in the smarter balance. And that isn't smart, no pun intended. So let me just comment specifically on 1432. If 1432 did pass, it really would, the financial question that was raised earlier, we would lose our waiver and go back to the No Child Left Behind, the adequate yearly progress. And that's the root of our issues, because we could potentially lose over $100 million in federal funding as a result of outlawing the annual assessment. So that's the answer to the financial question. Someone mentioned the special education. I think this law actually, ironically, if it passed, would inflict the most pain on our poorest children and the schools that depend on that funding for the math, reading, and the special education specialists. Also, and that's just the beginning, the bill goes on to prohibit for several years the competency-based assessments that have been working for a decade. And as Mary described, this has been going on since the early 2000s. New Hampshire developed a new learning model that required competencies, and that became part of our minimum standards way back in 2003 to 4 under a Republican administration, became law in 2005 under a Democratic administration. And now our high schools are charged with fully integrating those competencies. From a business person's perspective, what we're looking for is competency-based learning. That's what we want. That's the potential employees that we're looking for. So both from an educational perspective, I'm a believer, but also from a business person's perspective. Representative Milo had asked this question, but as my reading of the law, it would outlaw the Common Core, and that's candidly virtually impossible to act upon at this point. Starting in 2007, New Hampshire developed the Common Core standards, and as Mary said, it's a great improvement over previous standards. And in talking with many, we take the State Board of Education on the road, so we're out there in school districts, and I can tell you that teachers and principals rely on these Common Core standards. It's already out there. It's already integrated. Now, I realize that the support from the federal government and is a disadvantage in some eyes, but I actually see the endorsement as a benefit. One of the great things about the Common Core, if you move from New Hampshire to Iowa, the 47 other states that have adopted them, you know where you are. If you're in 6th grade, you're in 6th grade, so you'll know where you are. So, I would just observe that suspending public education for 3 years while as Madam Chair, Representative Guile and Senator Stiles and 4 colleagues on the Assessment and Accountability Committee is very capable and passionate about education as they are, spending several months traveling the state cannot really do what we've done over the last 10 years. Let me talk a little bit about the Common Core in response to the question of why it hasn't worked necessarily in New York, but it has worked well in New Hampshire. It's because the New Hampshire teachers are behind it. They don't fear this as an employment issue or pay-driven, high-stakes testing. And when I chat with them, they're not teaching to the testing. I mean, that's a great soundbite, but they don't do that. They actually use the testing as a guide to instructional improvement rather than to hold schools and teachers accountable. In the first 2 years, there was no federal requirement that the annual test play any role in any teacher evaluation. After that, while student performance must be part of the evaluation in Title I schools, the annual assessment need only be a minimal part of that performance. So one of the many benefits of supporting teachers in this way is that they're free to work on learning and to adapt the lesson plans. Again, I've heard from so many teachers firsthand and superintendents how successful the process can be. So I can tell you that the Smarter Balanced Scorecard Assessment will provide our teachers a valuable plan of the feedback they need to develop the Common Core. And we candidly are fortunate to have selected and helped develop the right assessment solution from the Hampshire Children. As the representative mentioned, we looked at everything. The Smarter Balanced Scorecard is the best practice assessment. That's absolutely true. Again, we don't teach to the test. As far as collecting data and the privacy issues, those are nice sound bites, but there's no more collection of data that will be done under this versus the NECAP. So, thank you for your attention. I urge you to recommend inexpedient to legislate on House Bill 1432. And so I don't get in the way of the military and the people from Washington, if you want to discuss this with me, please come to our legislative reception tonight at Belmont at 4 o'clock. And over strawberry and chocolate, we can debate the issue, but you've got to kill this bill. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning, Madam Chairman. I will submit written testimony in light of the time constraints that we have. Scott McGilvery, President of NEA New Hampshire, representing 16,000 educators across the state, as well as being a 25-year classroom teacher at Manchester Memorial High School in social studies. I come to you in opposition of House Bill 1432. This bill, along with many others, introduced this legislative session in opposition to the Common Core and issues associated with its adoption do not bring any solutions to what we all should be discussing here, both as legislators, as teachers, as parents, and as citizens. What we need to be talking about is setting high standards for our students, for our educators, and for our schools across the state, and preparing them for a 21st century education. Nobody seems to be bringing a solution to that. We've done extensive surveying of our members. That's well publicized. 75% support the Common Core. Yes, there is angst around the assessment, and we'll talk about that. What we have found is that not all districts in the state of New Hampshire and schools are in the same place. They're all over the place, as the states are in the success of the implementation around Common Core. They're using varying methods of implementation and subsequent curriculum development. What we are finding is those districts that involve the educators in this process of implementation and assessment are having high rates of success, and the teachers are well behind that. When Common Core was written with extensive teacher involvement, and there was a lot of involvement of educators, both here in the state of New Hampshire and across the country, They used a couple criteria in the development of it. They wanted to have fewer standards than we previously had under No Child Left Behind. They wanted it to be clearer, and they wanted them to demand a higher order of thinking and reasoning. They'd be aligned to college and work expectations. And they include rigorous content and application of knowledge at a higher order of thinking. And they are informed by standards in other countries. We've heard it many times here in this committee. We love to compare education in New Hampshire with the other countries around the world. Common Core does that, so that all students are prepared to succeed in a global economy. I've testified before you the story of why our military schools, Department of Defense schools, have moved to the adoption of Common Core. The most successful schools we have internationally are the Department of Defense schools. New Hampshire members do have some reservation and certainly have angst around the assessment piece. Some have called for a delay of full implementation of Smarter Balance, but that is a federal issue. That is a Department of Education issue and not one done through legislation like this. I will address the fact that the NEA nationally, President Dennis Van Rokel, has come out and asking for a moratorium. I sat through a week of meetings last week with all 50 presidents and the leadership of the NEA, and we again look to a moratorium, but we will do that at the federal level, not at our individual state level. We can't do that, it's not the place for it, and we have come up with a plan of action, and President Van Rokel will be meeting with Arnie Duncan in the coming weeks, and as well as a number of other presidents, and I sit on that commission. So I offer 3 cautions when it comes to the assessments. We want to make sure that we don't misuse high-stakes testing for purposes of best interest of kids. We want to make sure that it's instruction for learning. We want to move to revisit and revise standards that will not bring us closer to improved quality of education. We need to think about the middle factors, not just assessment and it's there. We want to look at instruction and supports for learning. And my last caution is that a single assessment, regardless of how technically strong and broad, can't be mastered to 2 things. It can't be master to the accountability piece and the master to the instructional piece. And lastly, going back to the other part of this bill, I sat and chaired the committee in Manchester to align our developed social studies competencies 10 years ago. The same angst was heard by teachers then. Competencies, how are we going to assess them? We're going to do things differently. 10 years later, they're a great and a very effective way of measuring student success. And the most important thing next to student success is that we have improved instruction of our students by our educators. And with that, I will conclude my testimony in light of time and free to take any questions.
Thank you very much. Welcome. Are you hearing from the field, from teachers out in the schools here in New Hampshire, any trends that there isn't dollar supporting training or supplies needed to implement Common Core?
No, I have not heard specific stories. I would say that the NEA New Hampshire in the coming weeks will announce almost $500,000 in professional development money that we are going to work in conjunction with the Department of Education to provide over 130 highly qualified trainers to get out and lead the profession here. We're already finishing up training the first 30, and we'll be in the coming months training another 100, so that NEA New Hampshire will lead the cause here of making sure that we support our school boards and our schools with professional development around Common Core.
So in follow-up to that, so you're not hearing any trends that teachers are having difficulty implementing due to cost, anything different than what we've heard in the past on any other funding?
Not of cost, but certainly of the availability of time within their schedule to do so. We do, the districts do need to set aside time, and we're working through collective bargaining agreements to increase the amount of professional development opportunities throughout the state.
Thank you very much.